In Lusaka, Naledi sat quietly as her boyfriend Chanda laughed loudly with his friends. He loved showing off, loved pointing at her with that cruel smile. "She's just broke trash," he said, not caring that waiters and strangers heard every word. Everyone laughed along, and Naledi lowered her eyes, pretending it didn't hurt. What they didn't know was that she carried a secret no one could imagine. Her late grandmother, Mama Tandy, had left her 3 beautiful houses scattered across Lusaka and a trust filled with more money than Chanda had ever seen in his life. Mama Tandy had raised Naledi when her parents walked away, teaching her strength wrapped in silence. "Silence is power," she had whispered before she died. Naledi never forgot those words. So she let Chanda mock her in public, let him flaunt his fake wealth bought with borrowed money, and let him believe she had nothing. She smiled softly, even when the words cut deep, because she knew her moment was coming. Her silence was not weakness. It was waiting. Chanda saw a poor girl at his side, someone he could insult for sport. But Naledi saw something else, his arrogance, his lies, and the empire of debt he was building like a house of cards. She stayed patient, carrying her grandmother's lessons in her heart, biding her time. One day soon, the truth would break through his laughter, and the same people who called her broke would see her rise. Naledi only had to choose the right moment to speak. When Naledi was a little girl, her parents left her behind without looking back. The world could have been cold and empty, but her grandmother, Mama Tandy, stepped in and became her shelter. Mama Tandy was a strong woman, the kind of woman who had seen life's struggles but never let them break her. She raised Naledi with love, wisdom, and discipline. She taught her that real strength did not always shout, that sometimes the quiet ones carried the greatest power. Naledi grew up listening to her grandmother's stories, watching how she handled people with grace, and learning that silence could sometimes speak louder than words. What Naledi never knew as a child was that Mama Tandy was planning for her future in secret. While people thought they were poor, Mama Tandy was carefully buying land and houses in Lusaka. She signed deeds in Naledi's name, secured the papers, and worked with a lawyer to open a trust fund that would grow quietly over the years. She never bragged, never showed off, never told the neighbors. She only told Naledi one thing before she died: silence is power. "One day, you'll know when to speak." Naledi didn't fully understand then, but those words stayed in her heart like fire. Years later, sitting beside Chanda, Naledi would remember those words again and again. Chanda loved to show off fake designer shoes, flashy cars he didn't own, and dinners paid for with borrowed money. He bragged about wealth he did not have and mocked Naledi for not buying expensive clothes. People believed him because he made noise, because he looked the part. But Naledi stayed quiet. She knew something no one else in that room knew, that her grandmother's silence had built her a fortune far greater than Chanda's lies. So when Chanda laughed too loudly and called her broke, Naledi simply smiled. Inside, she saw her grandmother's face, strong and calm, reminding her that truth does not rush. Chanda was busy building castles on sand, but Naledi was standing on a foundation her grandmother had laid with love and foresight. She carried the weight of that hidden legacy in her heart, waiting for the day when her silence would no longer be a shield but a weapon. She was patient, she was steady, and every insult only made her remember Mama Tandy's voice: "Silence is power. Wait, my child. One day, you'll know when to speak." Naledi knew that day was coming soon, and when it did, the whole city of Lusaka would hear her speak. The night of Chanda's birthday party was supposed to be a celebration, but for Naledi it felt like stepping into a lion's den. The hall was filled with bright lights, loud music, and people dressed in their best clothes. Chanda walked around with his chest out, greeting guests like a king. He loved attention, and this was his night to shine. Naledi stayed close but quiet, wearing a simple dress, her beauty natural and unforced. She didn't need the glitter to stand out, but Chanda enjoyed making her feel small in front of others. As the night went on, Chanda lifted a glass and called for everyone's attention. He had that mischievous smile on his face, the one Naledi knew too well. He pointed at her as if she were a joke and said, "This girl here couldn't even afford a plate of food without me." The words hit like a slap. The crowd roared with laughter, glasses clinking, people whispering and nodding. Even the waiters smiled awkwardly, not knowing where to look. Naledi felt her heart squeeze, but her face stayed calm. She remembered her grandmother's voice in her mind: "Silence is power. One day, you'll know when to speak." Naledi could have walked out right then. She could have screamed, shouted, or thrown her drink in his face. But instead, she sat still, her back straight, her eyes clear. She did not let them see her break. She only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides storms behind it. To everyone else, she looked weak and embarrassed. But inside her, something was shifting. She wasn't broken. She was watching, waiting, and planning. As Chanda soaked in the laughter and carried on boasting, Naledi studied him carefully. She saw the way he needed people's applause, the way his whole image depended on noise and lies. He thought this party made him powerful, but Naledi knew better. His wealth was fake, his friends were shallow, and his pride was fragile. She understood something in that moment. Silence was not just about holding her tongue. Silence could be a weapon, a way to let someone reveal their own downfall. So Naledi stayed at the table, her head held high, even as the laughter rolled around her like waves. Her calmness was louder than any insult. Her eyes no longer showed pain but focus, a quiet determination. She thought of Mama Tandy, who had built an empire in silence while the world thought she was poor. Naledi realized this was her chance to do the same. She did not need to fight Chanda with words. She only needed patience, and soon the truth would fight for her. By the end of the night, Chanda was drunk with pride, surrounded by his friends and gifts. He believed he had won, that Naledi was nothing more than a shadow at his side. But as Naledi walked out of the hall, her steps were steady, her heart strong. The insults no longer cut her, they only fueled her. Her grandmother's words echoed again, silence is power. Naledi now understood. Her silence tonight was not weakness. It was the beginning of her rise. The morning after Chanda's birthday party, while he was still sleeping off the drinks and the noise, Naledi dressed neatly and took a taxi to downtown Lusaka. The city was busy as usual, buses honking, vendors calling out, and people rushing to work. But Naledi's heart was calm. She walked into a tall glass building, past the receptionist, and into a quiet office with polished wooden furniture and the smell of fresh paper. Behind the desk sat Attorney Baiko, a kind man with gray hair and sharp eyes who had known her grandmother for many years. When he saw Naledi, he stood up and greeted her warmly. "Your grandmother trusted you," he said softly. "And today, her trust will become your strength." He opened a large folder and slid it across the desk. Naledi's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were the documents that changed everything. There were property deeds with her name on them, 3 beautiful houses spread across Lusaka, each in a prime location. She flipped through rental agreements showing steady tenants who were already paying money into her accounts. And then, the bank statements. Her eyes widened when she saw the numbers. The trust her grandmother had built was not just a small fund, it was a fortune. Millions sat quietly in her name, growing year after year while everyone thought she had nothing. Naledi leaned back in her chair, holding her breath. For years she had been insulted, laughed at, and humiliated, but now she understood why Mama Tandy had told her to stay silent. This was not just money. This was security, respect, and freedom. This was the weapon her grandmother had left her. She smiled for the first time in days, a deep, confident smile. The world had called her broke, but now she knew she could buy more than Chanda had ever faked. Attorney Baiko leaned forward and said, "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She wanted you to know that silence does not mean weakness. She built this for you so that when the time comes, you can stand tall on your own." Naledi nodded, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind once again, "Silence is power. One day, you'll know when to speak." That day was drawing closer, and Naledi felt the strength of her grandmother's love all around her. She closed the folder carefully and pressed it to her chest like it was treasure. Her eyes no longer carried sadness, they carried fire. She walked out of the office and stepped back into the busy Lusaka streets, but this time, the noise didn't touch her. She felt taller, stronger, untouchable. She no longer saw herself as the girl who swallowed insults. She was now the woman who held an empire in her hands. As the taxi took her home, Naledi gazed out the window, her mind already painting the future. Chanda thought he had won last night, but he had no idea what was coming. Her silence was almost over, and when she finally spoke, the whole city would listen. A week later, Chanda decided to show off again. He called Naledi and told her to dress up because he was taking her to a luxury car dealership. He wanted to impress his friends and prove how rich he was. When they arrived, the showroom sparkled with polished cars, their bodies shining under bright lights. Chanda's friends were already there, laughing and pointing at the most expensive models. Chanda walked proudly, acting like every car in the room already belonged to him. Naledi stayed quiet, walking a step behind him as usual, her face calm and unreadable. As they admired a sleek black SUV, Chanda suddenly turned to Naledi with that cruel smile everyone knew. He raised his voice so the staff and his friends could hear. "Don't touch the cars," he said, chuckling, "they're not for broke hands." His friends burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the showroom. Even the salespeople exchanged glances, embarrassed but too polite to say anything. Naledi felt the sting of his words, but instead of lowering her head, she stood taller. She looked at Chanda for a moment, then calmly turned away. Without a word, Naledi walked straight to the manager's desk. Everyone watched, confused. She spoke softly but firmly, "I'll take the most expensive SUV you have. Cash." At first, the manager blinked in surprise, then nodded quickly, realizing she was serious. Naledi opened her handbag, pulled out her bank documents, and within minutes, the transaction was complete. The staff rushed to prepare the car. The room went silent. Chanda's friends stopped laughing. Their eyes widened as they saw Naledi receiving the keys to the most expensive car in the dealership. Chanda's face turned pale. He tried to keep his cool, pulling out his own card to buy a car, but when the machine beeped and declined his payment, the silence grew heavier. His hands shook as he tried again and again, but the result was the same. His wealth was nothing but empty show. Naledi, holding the shiny keys, looked around the room. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to mock him back. Her silence spoke louder than any insult. She walked past Chanda slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her head high. The same friends who once laughed at her now stared in shock, whispering to each other. The same staff who pitied her now looked at her with respect. Chanda stood frozen, his pride crumbling in front of everyone. The man who had called her broke trash had been exposed in the worst way possible. Naledi didn't glance back. She walked out of the dealership, the sun catching the new SUV as it rolled forward. In that moment, she wasn't the quiet girl Chanda mocked. She was the woman her grandmother had prepared her to be, calm, powerful, untouchable. That day, Lusaka whispered a new story. The broke girl was no longer broke. She had turned the tables, and her silence had spoken louder than Chanda's loudest laughter. Not long after the shocking scene at the car dealership, Chanda's perfect image began to break apart. At first, his friends tried to ignore it, but whispers started spreading across Lusaka. People began asking questions. How could a man who bragged so loudly fail to pay for a single car? Soon, the truth came out. His wealth was nothing more than a mountain of loans and favors. The clothes he wore were on credit, the dinners he paid for were borrowed cash, and even the parties he threw were financed by debts he could never repay. The same friends who once clapped for him now pulled away, embarrassed to be linked to his sinking ship. As the days passed, his lies collapsed like a house of cards. Banks came knocking, demanding their money. Letters piled at his door, each one stamped in red with the word overdue. His family's house, once a place of pride, was suddenly under threat of repossession. The furniture was marked, the walls seemed to close in, and the same neighbors who used to admire them now whispered behind curtains. Chanda, who once mocked Naledi in public, now avoided crowded places, afraid of the shame in people's eyes. While his empire of lies crumbled, Naledi's real foundation grew stronger. Quietly, with no noise or show, she moved into one of her grandmother's beautiful homes. The space was wide and peaceful, filled with light, and every corner reminded her of Mama Tandy's wisdom. She rented out the other 2 houses, and the steady stream of income began flowing into her account. Tenants respected her, neighbors admired her, and slowly her name began to circulate around Lusaka, not as the girl who was mocked, but as a young woman who owned property in prime locations. Naledi didn't brag. She didn't post pictures or boast to anyone. She simply handled her business with calm strength. Every morning she walked through her new home with quiet pride, watering the flowers in the garden, greeting neighbors, and signing rental agreements with tenants. Respect came naturally, without her even chasing it. People saw her not just as a landowner, but as someone wise beyond her years. Meanwhile, Chanda grew smaller in the eyes of the city. Invitations to parties stopped. His phone calls went unanswered. The same friends who once laughed at Naledi now laughed at him. His debts piled up faster than he could hide them, and the pressure broke the arrogance in his voice. He went from walking proudly in shiny shoes to moving quietly with his head low, hoping no one noticed him. Naledi, however, walked taller than ever. She remembered her grandmother's words every time she opened her bank statements and saw her income growing. Silence had carried her through humiliation, and now that same silence had raised her above the man who once mocked her. In a city where noise often fooled people, Naledi proved that real power never needed to shout. Months passed, and life in Lusaka began to change for both Naledi and Chanda. For Naledi, each day brought her more stability and respect. She managed her grandmother's houses carefully, made sure her tenants were comfortable, and kept her accounts growing. People in her community now greeted her with admiration, calling her a young woman of wisdom and strength. She walked through the city with quiet confidence, never needing to prove anything to anyone. Her grandmother's words lived in her heart every day, guiding her choices and giving her peace. For Chanda, the story was the opposite. The once proud man who loved to shout and show off had fallen into silence, but not the kind of silence Naledi carried. His was a silence of shame. His debts had eaten him alive, his friends abandoned him, and his fake pride no longer had an audience. His family's home was taken, his expensive clothes were sold, and the cars he used to brag about were long gone. The same people who once clapped for him now crossed the street to avoid him. His life had become a shadow of what it once was, and his name carried more pity than respect. One hot afternoon, Naledi sat in her garden sipping tea when she heard a soft knock at the gate. She didn't rush, she simply walked slowly, her calm presence unchanged. When she opened the small window on the gate, her eyes met a face she knew too well. Chanda stood there, no longer dressed in shiny suits, but in worn clothes that hung loosely on him. His eyes were tired, his pride gone. The same lips that once called her broke trash now trembled as he whispered, "Madam Naledi, please, I need your help." Naledi looked at him for a long moment. She didn't feel anger, nor did she feel the need to laugh at his fall. She simply saw the truth. The man who once mocked her was now broken by his own arrogance. She thought of Mama Tandy, of the nights she had comforted her as a child, and of the words that had carried her through every insult. Silence is power. One day, you'll know when to speak. She took a slow breath and said gently, "My grandmother taught me silence is power. This silence is my answer." Her voice was calm, steady, and final. She didn't raise it, didn't insult him, didn't give him the satisfaction of a fight. She simply let the words fall between them like a wall. Then, without another glance, she closed the gate. On the other side, Chanda stood frozen, realizing that the girl he once humiliated was now beyond his reach. Inside the gate, Naledi returned to her tea, her peace untouched. The tables had completely turned, and it was clear to everyone that silence had carried her higher than noise ever could. The charity gala was the grandest event of the year. The hall sparkled with chandeliers, the sound of clinking glasses filled the air, and every important figure in Lusaka seemed to be there. Naledi arrived in a simple but elegant gown, her confidence glowing brighter than any jewel. People turned their heads as she walked in, not because she was loud or flashy, but because her presence carried quiet power. She was no longer the girl sitting silently in corners, she was now a woman whose name was whispered with respect. As the evening went on, the host took the stage and began announcing the city's rising stars. When Naledi's name was called, the room broke into applause. She was introduced as one of the youngest and most successful property owners in Zambia. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and guests clapped louder, eager to hear her story. Naledi stepped forward, calm and graceful, holding her glass in one hand. For a moment, she looked out over the crowd, her eyes shining with quiet pride. Reporters leaned closer, microphones ready. "What is your secret to success?" one of them asked eagerly. The room went still, everyone waiting. Naledi lifted her glass slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Never underestimate the quiet ones," she said with a small smile. "They might just own the ground you're standing on." The hall erupted with cheers and laughter, the words spreading like fire. Guests clapped harder, some standing to give her an ovation. The cameras flashed even brighter, capturing the moment that would soon be shared everywhere. Naledi simply smiled and took a sip of her drink, her message clear. At the edge of the hall, hidden in the shadows, Chanda stood watching. His face was pale, his heart heavy. The woman he once mocked as broke now stood at the center of admiration, celebrated for the very strength he never saw. In that moment, he realized the truth he could no longer deny. The broke girl he laughed at now owned the future he had lost.